right, and with that, we're going to get started. I want to make sure that we have plenty of time for all the content that we want to cover today. Want to say thank you and welcome to everyone that's joining us today. I know that some of you are just ending classes, and thank you for extending your day. Hopefully you can relax a little bit. And also thank you to those of you who are taking a pause in your workday to join us. I'm very excited for what we're going to be going over today. My name is Leah Madison. I am the STEM program lead here at the Desert Research Institute. But before I get into our programming, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the original and continued sovereignty of Native nations in our region. The Numu, Nuwu, Nuwuvi, Niwi, and Washu, and everywhere. We acknowledge that the places where we conduct science have deep ancestral ties to Indigenous peoples, and we recognize that these communities continue to thrive today. So with that, the Desert Research Institute, for those of you who have not joined our workshops before, we are part of the Nevada system of higher education. We have two campuses, one in Reno and one in Las Vegas, and we have research faculty that are all over the world. Our education department is really the conduit of how to bring the work that DRI faculty members are doing into the community. And we find amazing local resources to partner with and share with our education community. And so that is why we're bringing not only our DRI scientists today, but also you and our faculty member as well. You'll learn more about our education program and our resources at our second part of our workshop on the 29th. I also wanted to mention, give gratitude to NV Energy and Southwest Gas for their funding to make this programming possible. A few housekeeping things. We have two speakers today. At the end of each presentation, we'll have a 5-minute reflection period. We would love to have you guys share a takeaway, some way you can use this in the classroom, some way that you can share ideas with others and maybe give them some points to start with. For those of you who joined a little bit later, I want to mention if you're joining us for CEUs, make sure your name, the Zoom name, matches the name that you registered with. We will use this for attendance to turn in to provide proof that you were part of our workshop. We also have an attendance link at the end of the workshop you will need to fill out. We have a raffle as well. So we are giving away 2 Amazon gift cards. You have to be present and you have to show us that you're here at the end of the workshop to get those prizes. And then into our content. So we really listen to our educators and what they want to be learning about our scientists and the work that's being done. And they have told us that they are really interested in some of the ethical considerations around science. So we have brought together Dr. Jennifer Willett from UNR to help explain kind of the basics of what environmental justice is, followed by Dr. Alan Gertler, also from DRI, who's going to be providing a real world example of how research can address some of these principles. Make sure to join us next week where we will follow up with Dr. Willett's students on how they have applied this in the classroom. I was able to see that presentation with those students, and I kind of left that presentation with a, how did they do this look on my face? So I really do hope that you follow up with us for that second workshop. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Willett. So Dr. Willett received her PhD in social work from University of Connecticut and is currently an assistant professor at the College of Social Work, which I incorrectly sent out as a College of Business before, so I apologize about that, Dr. Willett. But she is at the University of Nevada, Reno. She has done research on climate and environmental justice across the state, including Las Vegas and also in Kenya. Her current research project is a citizen science model with youth and communities affected by environmental injustice. They will be highlighted in our second workshop on the 29th. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Willett.
Being there for a second. Okay, I am Jennifer Willett. Thank you, Leah. And I'm going to be talking about my favorite topic, environmental justice, which is what I work on in the School of Social Work. So I'm going to start with environmental injustice, the opposite of what we're aiming for. Environmental injustice, the definition here, is disproportionate exposure of low income or communities of color to environmental hazards. Now, what that often looks like is something like this. So we see on the left there, a healthy, wealthy neighborhood, right? But we see on the right, a lower income neighborhood with a factory, an environmental hazard in their area. And the research bears this out. We know that in low income and communities of color in our country, environmental hazards are driven or intentionally placed to communities that are low income like this, and now that affects their environment. But environmental injustice might also look like this. But climate change is also an environmental injustice. So I have two maps I'll show you to explain this. We can see that the countries that are the largest contributors to climate change are the United States, India, China, and the EU. However, as you can see here, the countries that are most impacted by climate change are Sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East. So the regions that bear little responsibility for causing climate change are the ones that are being forced to adapt. They're also the countries with the fewest resources in the world, which makes it an injustice, right? Some other examples of environmental injustices are things that you've probably heard of. We have Flint, Michigan, which has lead contamination in the water in a low-income Black community. We've long known that low-income communities that are located next to highways tend to lead to asthma, particularly in kids. There's an area in Louisiana called Cancer Alley. This is where a high concentration of chemical plants and Black communities are located together, which then leads to high cancer rates. And in our own state, in Nevada, we have a coal plant next to an indigenous community. It's no longer there, but they didn't want it there. These are environmental injustices. So it goes beyond conservation though, really, like the impacts of environmental injustice are the impacts on people. So we know that there are a number of negative impacts here. Health-wise, we have asthma, diabetes, lung cancer. A study just came out that pollution causes your brain to change, which leads to mental health concerns and developmental problems. We have economic impacts. So in our state, if water has been transported out of your area and you're a farmer, you have now lost your job and you might have to move and have new bills. We also have cultural impacts, particularly in indigenous communities. There are lost burial grounds and destruction of sacred sites. In Nevada, there was a mine that was placed over a mountain that was a former sacred site. And then because people are moving, communities are dispersed and culture is shifting. The people who are most likely to be impacted by environmental injustice are people of color and ethnic minorities, women, children, elderly, and people with disabilities. And they're most likely to be impacted because they're either being targeted by things because they're the path of least resistance, or they have fewer resources to respond and to cope with environmental changes. So to sum up what I've presented so far, when environmental problems are mirroring oppressive forces, that is environmental injustice. The groups that are most likely to be impacted by environmental injustice are already dealing with other challenges like poverty. And then these communities have fewer resources to respond, so it's more challenging for them to adapt. Therefore, environmental injustice just becomes a threat multiplier for already vulnerable people that makes their lives significantly worse. A complication here too is that environmental injustice is kind of presented as this like one-off problem. There's this factory in one community, but that's not actually what tends to happen, especially in Nevada. What we usually see is we have this vulnerability, we have poverty, or for some other reason they're being targeted. There's an environmental hazard that they can't stop, and they have few resources to respond, so their vulnerability cycles even worse, which makes them more vulnerable to the next situation. For example, if you're trying to adapt in a flood and you spend all of your savings to try to adapt to that, the next hazard that comes along, maybe it's a wildfire, there's no more money to adapt anymore. An important point in here is that communities that are being affected by this don't have a say in decisions made about them with environmental decisions. So this is one of the solutions we aim for, is to have a greater say. But obviously, they don't want any of this to happen to them, and the choices are out of their hands. I think a good point of understanding is to understand the development of environmental justice, or what we used to call environmental racism, and how this movement shifted our laws, so then we can talk about the laws. Environmental racism started in Warren County in North Carolina in 1978. And during that time, the state had planned to build a landfill for a carcinogenic substance in the community that was mostly Black and very low income, and very against this landfill. They responded by protest, as you can see here. One of the men who is lying on the ground later became a congressman, because it was a big movement that people had heard of. Now, they didn't win, but they jump-started the national conversation on these issues, which then led to legal changes. So in 1994, an executive order was signed into law that mandated federal agencies needed to assess environmental justice impacts in their actions. And it still stands, they still do this. And there is an interagency working group that has people from the White House and other agencies in it that are working on environmental justice issues. Over time, the EPA has defined what environmental justice means, so what we're aiming for. There's three components here. The first is that there needs to be equal benefits. So often the environmental hazard has benefits like good jobs, but the jobs then will go to outsiders, not people in the community. That can't stand if there's environmental justice. Two, like I'm sure you know, there are burdens with these environmental hazards. With environmental justice, the burdens need to be shared equally. All of the hazards can't just be sat in low-income communities. And third, communities need to have a say in decisions made about them. That's going to help the first two there, but it's also going to have greater help them advance their power so they can have more say in other things too. Now, where the laws are really great, the laws don't address the underlying vulnerabilities. Why are some communities targeted, like low-income communities of color, while others are not? So when we don't address these issues, what we tend to see in Nevada as well is that even if a community is successful at getting out one environmental injustice, they're just going to be targeted again in the future because their vulnerabilities remain. So beyond the federal goals, the movement of environmental justice aims to address these vulnerabilities. Most people credit the principles of environmental justice as a guiding document for this, and they were written at the People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit. So they're really easy to find. If you just Google those, you'll be able to find it. It's a main document of the field. And they're trying to address racism and poverty, which will then reduce the environmental targeting. They're also looking at things to protect the land and culture, ensure safe livelihoods, and support liberation. Now, certainly these principles are an ideal, but the environmental justice laws have been in place since 1994, and the problems still remain on the ground. So I think it's worth thinking about this ideal rather than stopping at the minimum. So I'm about halfway through, so I'm gonna give you some examples of some work that I've done to illustrate what I've been talking about. I think it'll make more sense. I've done 3 studies on climate and environmental justice. The first I did, I looked at climate migration in Kenya. I'm not going to be talking about that, but I'd be more than willing to discuss that offline or through the questions. I also documented environmental injustices in Nevada in partnership with a local nonprofit here, and that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about. And then the third, I have a citizen science participatory action research project with youth who go to Title I schools, and they're going to be presenting on the 29th. So I would love if you could come and hear more about that. So the key with environmental justice or injustice is that it occurs when the socioeconomic conditions and the environmental conditions are just wrong and they intersect in a way that harms people. Unfortunately, Nevada has a lot of those that intersect. So Nevada is a diverse state and it's one of 5 majority minority states. However, there's significant poverty in Nevada that occurs directly along the lines of race. Poor or people of color are more likely to be poor in the state. Locale is very important in Nevada. As you know, most of the population lives with you all in Las Vegas, but that creates a power differential with the rural frontier areas that are highly impacted by some of these issues. There are many unincorporated areas, which are areas with no local government. So decisions have to be made really far away from where the problem is, which takes away that local control. And then, as you know, as educators, our sales taxes are just not sufficient to fund the services that we need. So a lot of the communities that need some extra support don't get anything at all. Now we combine these with environmental conditions. So mining is a very common industry in our states. These mines tend to be near low-income communities, and they're also owned by international communities. So that local control is not always there. And even with the recent changes, mines don't pay enough in taxes, so they're not giving back. There is no equal benefit there. Relatedly, we have numerous Superfund sites in the states, which are usually due to old mines that weren't fully cleaned up. So you can get federal funding to clean up the Superfund, but then you have to be declared a Superfund site. This is a problem in some of the rural areas that are doing things like ranching or farming. They don't want to be located near a Superfund site. Makes sense, right? The nuclear test site was in our state, which I would personally consider an egregious environmental injustice. And we know that it was put here because it was in a devalued area with devalued people, including poor white communities and tribal communities. Nevada is projected to be one of the most impacted states from climate change, and yet we've almost had no preparation to prepare for this. The Southern Nevada Water Authority pipeline has been a big point of discussion in rural areas, of course, and that's when the Southern Nevada Water Authority proposed to redirect water from Eastern Nevada to Las Vegas, which would have decimated Eastern Nevadan communities that are around ranching and farming. And something that the kids will talk about that they're very concerned about in their neighborhoods is dumping. This occurs in lowly regulated and vulnerable communities. So where the youth that I work at, they'll say things like, people feel entitled to put their trash here just because of the low income community. So they're kind of the baseline of what I've been doing, but I want to share with you some voices from the front line of what it feels like to live in one of these communities and the issues that people deal with. So like I was talking about in the background, we often talk about environmental justice or injustice, that it is a singular event in one community, but that's just not the reality often of what is happening with people. So I'm just going to give you an example here. I was working in an area that is an indigenous community, and we were talking about the impacts of mining, and that was the original point of discussion. However, everybody wanted to talk about other things. So people wanted to talk about nuclear testing because they were near the test sites. They then wanted to talk about the threat of Yucca Mountain. And then it went into other things that didn't seem a lot like related to the environment, but it was related in a way in terms of environmental justice. So they wanted to talk about the legacy in their community from boarding schools. They wanted to talk about history of forced relocation to poor land and how that now intersects the current environmental justice issues. They wanted to talk about future impacts, the coming impacts of climate change. And they wanted to talk about the local control of their land. They didn't have a lot of it because they were living on federal land. So all of these things intersect, right? It's not just a one-off, the mine is the problem. A lot of things are the problem. But what this says is that they were systematically devalued. So then the mine can move in and do what they wanted without having good relationships or benefits with the community. Other people talked a lot about discrimination and oppression. So I want to share a little bit with what they said with you. So one Indigenous male who was living on a Superfund site or near a Superfund site, he said, if Indigenous people incur the risk, then nobody really cares. If it's poor people, no one cares. Racial discrimination where you choose to contaminate, the definition of environmental injustice. Another person said, who was an Indigenous female living near the nuclear test site, said the disproportionate impact is always generally to those that don't have political clout to fight back, which is low income and lack of political representation. And then a Latinx farm worker who was talking about how he felt that his brother was poisoned by pesticides during his job. He said, I see it as an abuse because the majority of people working there are Hispanic. Classic definitions of environmental injustice, but in the real world here. Now we have these laws, so why aren't people using them to protect their communities? Well, I found that they are trying, they're just not getting their voices heard. So one female who was white, but she lived in a mining community, organized her community to stop the new mine. She went to meetings, she met with county officials over and over again, and yet they approved the mine from 100 miles away over their concerns. In response, she said, our frustration is that there are thieves around us and we've lost our voice. Democracy is dead in America. It doesn't matter what we think or what happens to us. No one cares. It's devastating. And likewise, a former tribal chairman was trying to work with the federal authorities to discuss their concerns around Yucca Mountain, and they were just flatly told, we're not interested in buffalo stories. Now, some people were able to get in the room or seat at the table, and yet they still couldn't influence the decisions made about them. A woman who was a tribal negotiator between the community and the mining company said, it's just like they have a checklist. Dealt with Indians, check. Lack of good faith engagements. Another female activist went to a federal conference that was organized to talk to the Indigenous community, and yet when it was their turn to talk, it was the last 2 hours of the day, and the only people left in the room were Indigenous activists. So we have these key components, equal benefits, equal burdens, and community involvement, but we can see that they're not enough. What we need to do is to work on the structural equality, work on reducing the vulnerabilities so people have a say in the process and they're not targeted with environmental injustice anymore. So to sum up, I think the solution is to go back to the principles, the founding documents, and work to drive resources to communities in need so they can adapt. Communities often ask for more resources. Secondly, work to end unjust structures in society. When I ask people what they need to help with their environmental injustice situation, the number one thing people say is to increase the minimum wage, which doesn't seem overly connected, right? But it's actually talking about reducing that vulnerability. And third, I think we need to support local decision-making and listen to community input. They have things to say, they live there, they know what is gonna work best. We need to listen to them. So I'm gonna close with one more quote, and this is a tribal chairman who won an environmental justice battle. So I think that although the principles are an ideal, it is something that is achievable. He said, you don't have to have this status or be this type of person to obtain your goals. You can work together as a community to take on these huge corporate entities to get the human rights we should have. In other words, environmental justice is difficult to achieve, but you can do it. So I'll stop there.
So with that, I am going to introduce Dr. Alan Gertler. So Alan, he is a longtime supporter of our programming and very well versed in everything DRI. He has received his PhD in physical chemistry, not geochemistry, correction there, from the University of California, and is the Roman Micaiah Hayes Global Science Diplomacy Senior Fellow at the Global Council for Science and the Environment and Long Island University. He wears many hats. He supports the development of programs focused on improving environmental health and fostering collaborations between scientists and policymakers to implement practical science-based solutions that address collective global issues. He previously served as the Desert Research Institute's Vice President for Research and the Director of DRI's Clean Technologies and Renewable Energy Center, under which all of DRI's renewable energy research, education, and outreach is conducted. And with that, I will hand it over to him.
Thanks, Leah. I'm going to sort of take a little bit of a different tack. My research focused on air quality, atmospheric chemistry, and a lot of that was on the impact of mobile sources on the environment, and also determining what are the sources that contribute to pollutants that we all breathe. And a lot of that was done in megacities across the world. So, that got me thinking. When I look at these sources, where are they coming from? And a lot of it was they were coming from our need for energy. That drove so much of this, which then got me thinking about renewable energy, and how that can affect what we have. And so for this presentation, what I wanted to do was tell you a little bit about, energy issues that we have. Also look at the impacts of some of those, our use of energy on marginalized communities. Talk a little bit about, this is going to sound complex, the energy, climate, pollution, water nexus. It's sort of like what Professor Willett was saying. Look at these things holistically. Don't look at energy over here, climate over here, air pollution over there. They're all part of one big thing. And to me, a lot of the solution for these environmental issues, not the policy side, but at least other things that can help develop policies, really get into renewable energy systems. What can they do? We all hear about this. We'll talk about green energy and everything else. So what does it mean? What are the trends? What are the prospects? What are the implications of all of this? What are the barriers that we have? So, let's see. It's just going to let me, why is it not letting me? There we go. First issue, energy security. We need energy. I mean, we can't get rid of it overnight. I mean, it's obviously an issue that we have. You look at it, you see it's constantly growing, especially in the developing world. That's where most of the growth is projected. But even here, even in the Americas, it's still growing. We require energy. And anytime you start this conversation and say we don't need energy, dead in the water, not happening, not going anywhere. But what are the solutions we can come up with to address the problems that a need for energy causes? Another issue, climate change. This is out of the 2013 Intergovernmental Panel assessment over here, where they said unequivocally, the climate system is changing, it's leading to, average increases in water and air temperatures, widespread melting of snow and ice, sea level rise, all of these things. We used to have discussions where, arguments over, is it real, is it not? I think these days we're past that point. I think, I haven't heard anybody say climate change is not occurring. Okay, maybe a couple of years ago, yes, but not now. What's driving that? And what's driving it is carbon dioxide, but also methane and black carbon. What are these things? Well, you get carbon dioxide when you combust fuel, but you also get methane from mobile source emissions. Also, when you do fracking, a lot of leaks, a lot of methane. Black carbon. Okay, anybody today wind up behind a diesel school bus? There's probably a few of you, who did, right? So you see that those black particles come out? That's black carbon. It's black, it absorbs heat. That's a major driver of climate change. But that's another form of our energy use within transportation. So you have, another issue we have is air pollution. from a use of, burning of fossil fuels. Every few years, the WHO comes out with a report. They go through data all over the world, and they come up with an assessment of deaths attributable to air quality, both indoor, that's household, or outdoor. Okay, so last one said 7.3 million people. You know what? That's 1 in 8 deaths worldwide is due to air pollution. Third, pre-COVID, third largest cause of death worldwide, air quality. A lot of it's in China, India, developing world. For the indoor ones, this is cooking. This is using fuel for cooking and heat, a lot of that. And so we see, the air pollution impact on, human life, both mortality and morbidity, which of course gets back to the environmental justice issue. Where are you getting exposure? Again, look at these pollutants. Sulfur dioxide, 99% from our energy use. Oxides of nitrogen, 99% from energy use. Particulate matter, that's the one that causes the mortality, 85% from our need from energy. Carbon monoxide, 92%. Hydrocarbons plus oxides of nitrogen, now I'm going to get into the chemistry, okay, excuse me, wind up forming ozone in the atmosphere. So you have all of those being formed. They're from energy. Ammonia from fertilizer, okay, less so. But we see energy produces all these pollutants with all of these other effects. I'm not really going to talk about this here. Professor Willett talked about it a little bit in terms of water. Our need for energy drives a lot of our water use. We use more water for energy than any other source, more than agriculture. And we use more energy for water, for clean water and for moving it. But if you look at 2015, 41% of our total water use was for energy production. Think about that, especially in Nevada, not that much energy. Not that much water. Okay, so we have all this confluence of all of these different things caused by our need for energy. What about marginalized communities? Well, communities of color are more likely to live closer to polluting industries. Let's go back to India and Bhopal, what happened there. Also, they can't afford to move or decline work. So they are exposed, they are preferentially exposed. The other thing is redlining. I submitted a proposal 2 weeks ago with a group at Penn State on developing, a curriculum for disadvantaged communities and getting students involved, with looking at, with understanding atmospheric contributions over here. This is FNOAA, and this blew me away. One of the guys put this in the proposal and said that when they looked at redlining and they looked at different communities, they found up to a 20 degrees Celsius, not Fahrenheit, Celsius difference in the same area, but between different communities. I mean, that's incredible. You know what that says? Picture Las Vegas, the areas with trees, the areas without trees. I mean, I saw that number, I was blown away. I can't imagine, 20 degrees C. That's nuts. But he sent me the stuff, and that's what he found. Also, you had a nationwide study. They looked at people of color, Black, Latino, the Asian communities, what were they exposed over here? And you could see the numbers, what you had for Black communities, people of color versus white communities. They also split this apart socioeconomically. I mean, clearly there were disadvantaged white communities, no doubt about it, okay? But when you look at this and just compare people of color, 7.4 microgram per cubic meter of PM 2.5 versus white communities, 5.9. Well, what does that mean? Okay, those are, I have a feel for that because I work in that area. 1 microgram per cubic meter of a PM 2.5 concentration leads to a 14% increase in the mortality rate ratio. That means you die. Okay, 14% increase. So 1.5 microgram per cubic meter, at that point, you're dealing with roughly a 20% difference in the mortality rate ratio for these communities, between communities of color and white communities. Obviously, many reasons where people can live, complex situation. Another study, recent study, looking at California, when they were looking at Black, Latino, and Asian Californians exposed to PM 2.5, 43% higher for Black, 39% higher for Latino, and 20% higher for Asian compared to the white communities. Those numbers are, amazing differences. And then factor in something like COVID. In the Willett et al. Paper, this was put out, this is from the public health group at Harvard. They found that, for an increase of 1 microgram per cubic meter in PM 2.5 was associated for an 8% increase in the COVID-19 death rate. So, okay, take a 1.5 microgram per cubic meter difference. That basically means, you're exposed to that, you got a 12% increase of chance of dying. Your death rate is 12% higher. This is what marginalized communities are exposed to when it comes to these pollutants. Okay, that first study that I showed in the last slide, New York Times picked it up. This was a nice little diagram that they had in the article I found in the Times. Looking at the different sources, you can see the Black communities, they're exposed when you look at construction sources, power plants, industrial sources, cars and trucks. They get hit a lot higher than other communities. Little more, some differences with all people of color. And obviously, white communities wound up coming up slightly higher when it came to the power plants. But you can just see the Black communities, they are hit hard. So, I've given you a lot over here so far. We've looked at, what energy does in terms of pollutants, climate change, other things. We've seen how it affects communities of color. I'm going to make the argument that one of our solutions is actually going towards renewable energy. Because when we look at this, you look at coal. Obviously, coal solves a lot of our energy problems. But look at the pollution. Look at the water use. Look at the waste. Natural gas. Natural gas is 40% more efficient than coal. Okay, so it's a great transition. But look at the effect on groundwater, air quality. We're still producing CO2, and there's an amazing amount of leaks at these natural gas sites. A lot of methane, and methane is 1,000 times greater, cross section for radiative forcing than CO2. So big problem. Nuclear, you hear nuclear is a solution to climate change. Well, it is in some ways, but there's also risk concerns with the public. There's also waste issues. And one of the other big issues is the water use. You need water for cooling nuclear plants. And a lot of these are located on rivers. The rivers are getting water. That margin for safety is getting less. So there are other problems. Biofuels. A lot of what we call renewable energy now is biofuels, but there are water issues there, water competition, land use, agricultural productivity. All of these are, somewhat problematic. I'm not going to talk about this thing on energy efficiency because energy efficiency, as Amory Lovin said, he calls it megawatts instead of megawatts, is really a great way for conserving energy. But when we look at other renewable energy resources, these are indigenous resources, so we don't have to deal with the energy security issue. We have it. Low carbon footprint. But what's the impact on the grid? What are the logistical issues? So I'm going to talk a little bit about that before sort of trying to wrap things up over here. First, let's look at the resource. If you look at our need for energy, just in solar alone, we've got more than 1,000 times more solar energy available than what we need. Wind, again, a tremendous resource, way more than we need. We have all of these. So when we look at these other potential energy sources, we have it. It's not like it's going to limit our energy needs. If you look at where we stand now, there was a more recent one that just came out in the report. I put this one in because the graphic fit a little better. But what we have is still about 80% of our energy comes from fossil fuels. Only about 10% from what we call modern renewables. Being wind, solar, hydro, So it's still not that much. We've got a long, long way to go over here, but it's getting there. It's really, really changing. A lot of countries are putting in regulations. We're seeing that increased growth in regulations all over the world for what they have. That's been ramping up. In the interest of time, I took out other slides that showed, what they were, where they are, carbon pricing schemes, but it's amazing what different countries are trying to do. But here's the kicker. And I think this, to some extent, may be the way to really drive this whole argument. Cost. This darker gray area here, that's the fossil fuel cost range, between 5 and like 17 cents, per kilowatt hour. Look at where the renewables are. Look at where we are with solar PV. It's cheaper. Look at where we are for onshore wind. Look at where we even stand currently for offshore wind. Concentrated solar still is right at the top end, but getting there. You know what? It's cost effective. And the fossil fuel number, it doesn't include the externalities. What do I mean by externalities? Those are the other costs associated with our use of fossil fuel. The healthcare costs, the true cost for water, the climate change costs. Those aren't included in the cost when we say 5 cents a kilowatt hour. Those costs are a lot higher. We're competitive right now with renewables. I mean, you never hear that, all you hear is it's going to kill jobs or it's going to do other things. It's not. What's killing over here is our use of fossil fuels. We have these alternatives, and as the money goes, I think we're going to see it driving in that direction. So to get at the question, what's going to work and what's not going to work, people listen to the money. They often don't listen to to arguments about other things, especially with marginalized communities. But if it's the money, then they start to move. And this type of graph really shows that over here. So who's doing it? Well, all over the world. And the US is doing a lot. China's doing more than you could even imagine. India less so, but these are some of the countries that are doing things by technology over here. And I'm going to show a few things. What's amazing here is if you look at the growth, for example, in ethanol production, ethanol being from biofuels, US is number 1. The answer to that, of course, is, anybody want to yell it out? How about the Iowa caucuses? That's why we're number 1 for ethanol. It's called corn. And look at the growth for what we have. So we see that. But that's another way of getting liquid fuels. Obviously, there are the issues I pointed out before with the water issues, the land issues, the food issues. You've got all of those other parts. So for my mind, it's not my favorite, but it is something that we've used that's sort of a little more neutral when you start looking at pluses and minuses. What about geothermal? US is number 1. Within the US, it's California, followed by Nevada, followed by Utah. Italy's up there. By the way, this is all in one power plant. And my wife will tell you that when I took her to Tuscany, we went to a power plant. It's true, we did. But it was this 800 megawatt geothermal plant in the middle of Tuscany that was built in 1904. It was great. And here you see the ring of fire to everything. You just see that coming across, and you just see how much we have of geothermal. But look at this number, roughly about 4 gigawatts for the US. Okay, geothermal pluses over there. Overall pretty good. Solar, US is 54, more than 10 times. But look at China, 131 gigawatts. And this is a couple of years ago. We've plateaued. They've gone up in terms of this. So you really see Germany. Look at Germany. Does anybody think of Germany as a sunny country? 42 gigawatts and increasing. By the way, in the last report I read, Japan has passed the US in terms of solar capacity. So, a lot of solar, a lot of pluses for the energy resource, some issues of solar thermal with water use over here. This is really the big problem, is the 24/7. When it's not sunny, you're not getting solar PV. That's a downside. How do you deal with that? That's one of the big problems, is that, discontinuity. It's not continuous. Geothermal is continuous, but this isn't. That's the real issue that we face, with solar. Look at wind. Look at the US, 90 gigawatts. China, double that. 190 gigawatts over there. By the way, good trivia question. What state has the largest wind resource? Texas. Texas produces more wind than any other state. You would have thought oil. No, Texas, wind. It has the advantage that it has its own grid, but quite a bit over there. Again, same type of problem, the intermittency. That's the issue, that intermittency over there. Otherwise, it's really pretty good. Hydro. We see it at the Hoover Dam. What happens is we have less water. We can't create more. That's the real limitation here. It's that limited growth due to resource availability for what we have. So it's resource limited. You've got land use issues, but real positive. But where are we going with this? We're developing storage. So even though wind and solar may be intermittent, with these other storage solutions that are coming up, that helps levelize the amount of production. Because one thing I didn't really talk about is the grid. The grid is not something that can take all the energy produced and send it around. It has to be balanced. Otherwise, it collapses. So you always have to have something that's going to flatten it out. One way we do it now is with natural gas. We couple, what they call peakers. These are basically jet engine type of things that produce power from natural gas. They can cycle them up and down. Can't do that with coal, can't do that with nuclear. That's when I said earlier, natural gas is a good transition. But as we develop other batteries, as we develop other solutions like this pumped hydro, where during the day when the sun is shining, pump it up. At night, let it flow down. And you use that to levelize everything out. So that's what we're starting to see in terms of solving these problems that we have. So where are we going? Nuclear is looking like it's going to be flat. Coal's flat. We're seeing an increase in renewables, seeing an increase in petroleum. Our energy demand continues to grow. We have all of these environmental impacts, but we have this large renewable energy resource. And I think we can really address a lot of those issues that we have with the storage, with the grid, with others. So what are the prospects? Again, great prospect for resource availability. Health and environmental concerns are a key driver, especially when it affects other communities. We're continuing to see lots of new policies. We're at cost parity, and that's not even taking into account those externalities. But issues of intermittency, natural gas is still pretty cheap. And we don't account for subsidies. And of course, the issue has become politicized, So hopefully we're coming to some agreement on it. So the take-home message that I want to leave you with is, marginalized communities are disproportionately impacted by our need for energy. They get hit harder than the average community over here. They face the consequences of climate change more so than we do, more so than many do. They face it from air pollution. They face it from the water issues. All of that hits them harder. But when you look at renewable energy, alternative energy sources, they can really solve our future energy needs while mitigating those environmental impacts. And I think the money's going to drive it. Maybe that's because I'm in New York and Wall Street is like that way, 10, 50, well, about 20 minutes for me to get to Wall Street. It's actually one subway stop away from me, now that I think about it, under the river. So, I think the money's going to drive it, but clearly we have to overcome the barriers of transitioning to this resource. So anyway, that's a sort of big overview, less on my research, more on where I see these things going, at least for solving these problems. So thanks for listening to me.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Gertler. That was very informative. I walked away with a much better understanding of the topic.